Hey,
Hi, how
Charlotte.
are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Just wanted to make sure that I didn't hop in late or anything, and I wanted to make sure everything's shared appropriately. So
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and
sure.
test it right now.
Let's see. All right. So if I share screen in that slideshow presentation, is that what?
That's
Oh,
perfect.
okay.
That's perfect.
Popping up. Okay.
Yep. Slides
Okay.
are progressing.
Awesome. Okay, great. And then I'll stop share until.
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Well, is it hot and humid up there?
I have the air conditioner running, and I hate running it. But
Yeah.
I know. I have never owned an air conditioner up until this is 3 years ago. I've never had one in my entire life, but
Yeah.
climate change.
We just cracked too. We got it this spring, and thank goodness, because it's been a hot summer for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you in Orleans or?
Yes. Yeah, actually Harwich.
Okay.
Yeah, so in New Orleans daily right now in Harwich.
Nice. That's great. I worked down in Falmouth and Woods Hole for a little bit, and I grew up on the South Shore. So
Oh, nice.
yep. I hate I have split screens. I'm gonna try not to be that person that just looks like this the entire presentation.
I know I haven't gotten a second monitor yet, and I'm kind of just putting it off because everyone tells me once you get it, there's no go.
It's true. I went downstairs because I am work from home. I went downstairs to work on something while I had something on the stove, and I was just like, I'm sorry, I can't even see this anymore. I don't know. I can't do it without it. So yep. Definitely an addictive thing to have. I mean, I have folks that have 3 or 4. It's insane. So
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
mhm.
Well, yeah. I guess when you're looking at a ton of data, I can imagine that being really helpful.
Yeah, they're the coders, right? The ones that are running all the
Yeah.
computational scripts and stuff. So they just need to have it all working all at once. But yeah,
Right.
it's pretty intense. Mhm.
So just as folks are signing on here, they're in the meeting, so
Okay.
don't say anything incriminating.
Okay. I promise.
And I did check just before signing on here, and we had just over 30 registered. So
It's great.
number of folks coming on here.
Yeah, I'm hoping to do some time for Q&A at the end. I'm not going to fill the whole hour. So.
Perfect.
Okay.
Now, how long have you been at Bigelow?
Oh, let's see. Technically 2020, I think. So yeah, May 2020. So 2 years.
Yep.
Yeah, 2 years.
And was it with the launch of this project that you came on, or?
I came on, well, this project's actually kind of been going on, honestly, since about 2016. So before I went on with a bunch of iterations of internal funding and such. But so it's sort of been a baby at the lab for a long time. But the largest amount of funding just came in through the USDA just in the last year. So I've been, and that's what we call the Coast to Cow consumer launch. So I guess I've technically been on it previous to this iteration of the project, but it's pretty much been ongoing for years now.
I see.
So.
Well, yeah, with the USDA grant, it's a long-term commitment.
Yeah, this one's 5 years, and we have 3 of them all overlapping at once. It's a little little mind-blowing. And of course, that's this project's only one aspect of what we do at the Center for Sequence Solutions. So it's just it's a little mind-blowing, but we are we're getting through it.
Yeah.
It's great when there's only a couple hundred unopened emails in your inbox versus a couple thousand.
Yeah.
That's kind of where we're at, always just playing catch up, but it's a good place to be in. So
Definitely an exciting project.
Yeah. Are these recordings going up anywhere? Like what other
yes,
are you doing? What other people have you had for panelists in this?
Yeah, so before I get to that, Ken, is it okay if we record?
Yeah,
and post those on our website.
absolutely.
Yeah, I have this recording, but that's just a default setting. So
Mhm.
glad to
Yeah.
jump with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we always have a huge range of lecturers, in part because there are so many good land trusts and other environmental organizations like the Orleans Conservation Trust that have some sort of speaker series. So I've really enjoyed the possibilities that Zoom has brought, being able
Yes.
to reach out to folks like you who are a bit further afield and bring in some new faces, because there is kind of a cycle of
Yep.
the same, 50 or so speakers that
Yep.
folks
That's fun.
hear from a lot on the Cape. But we're fortunate to be in an area where there is so much environmental expertise. So we've had everything from, Atlantic white sharks to climate change in general, to how to sustainably grow food in your own backyard, to
Oh, fun.
vernal pools. So, really
Wow.
across the map.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I hope I think I dialed it in for a general audience. This is generally a loose interpretation of what I give as an introduction to undergraduate students. So it's a little bit sciencey, but hopefully not too aggressive. So.
Yeah. Well, we have a bright group that attends these talks regularly. So maybe seeing it as we're at just about 6 o'clock, I'll start with a very brief intro for you. And most folks on the call are familiar with the Orleans Conservation Trust, but in case not, we are a nonprofit land trust that operates within the town of Orleans, and we host this lecture series in the spring and in the fall, and guided walks. And we thank you all for being here tonight and partaking in our work. Recognize some of the names that are popping in here as volunteers and folks who are involved in the organization in all kinds of different ways. There are many ways to support us, and we thank you for all that you do. And get in touch with us at our office or at oct@orleansconservationtrust.org if you are interested in doing more. So I think this is a timely talk in a lot of ways, because right now we're experiencing a pretty extreme drought on the Cape. We've had some extreme heat this summer, and that's happening across the US, as I'm sure folks know, and it's happening across the world. I was traveling around Europe recently, and there is just so much brown scorched earth because it has been a really, really hot summer. And no doubt climate change is a big part of that. And I think with recent federal legislation in the Inflation Reduction Act, and then also significant state legislation in the state of Massachusetts to get out ahead of some of the climate goals that the state has set, I think this is a great opportunity to hear from Charlotte, our speaker tonight, on kind of a boots on the ground, and I'll call it behind closed doors research, or out of sight, out of mind for a lot of us who aren't thinking about all the innovation that is happening on a daily basis by hardworking people like Charlotte, who really want to find solutions to vast problems. And I applaud you, Charlotte. So Charlotte Quigley is the assistant director for the Center for Seafood Solutions at Bigelow Ocean Laboratories. I'm sure several of you have heard of Bigelow before, but if not, if you're ever on the Maine coast and have a chance to stop by and see Bigelow in East Boothbay, I would definitely encourage it. It's a state-of-the-art facility, and they're doing so much good work. This is a tiny piece of all the exciting work going on there on a daily basis. And with that, Charlotte, I can turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate it. Let me see if I can share my screen so that everyone can see it. All right. Is that sharing okay for everyone?
Great.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Stephen, for inviting me today. And thank you all for attending this talk. Again, my name is Charlotte, and yes, please come visit us in East Boothbay. We are always welcoming visitors at the Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences. And we encourage it immensely. And today I'm here to introduce you on a current project that we're working on at Bigelow called the Coast Cow Consumer Project, where we're exploring using various algae and seaweeds in feeds to dairy cows in hopes of reducing their methane emissions, enhancing their health and general production. So let me see if this is going to progress okay. Excellent. But as I just told you, and Stephen just said, we are from the Bigelow Laboratory of Ocean Sciences. We don't know that much about cows. And so we've built a large interdisciplinary multi-institutional team to tackle our suite of research questions. And these are our partner institutions that are showing up right now. And that also included a lot of input and partnership with many industry members, both in the dairy and the seaweed sectors, as well as the national and international foundations such as the World Wildlife Fund and FAR, which is the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, as well as others. And we're also really fortunate to have a diverse set of funding agencies to support our team's efforts. We have 3 different awards from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and we're working with 2 dairy cooperatives in New England, Organic Valley and Stonyfield. I'm sure everyone's had some of their products in their locally grocery stores. And then we're also very privileged to have funding from a philanthropic fund called the Shelby Cullum Davis Charitable Fund. So I just want to make sure that those are all recognized ahead of me diving into it today. So I think we've all recognized and heard about reducing our own carbon footprint. But our fundamental research question is, what is a cow's carbon hoofprint? And what can we do to learn more about that hoofprint? And can we in fact use algae or seaweed, I use those 2 terms interchangeably throughout the talk, to in fact reduce this carbon footprint? So greenhouse gases, a lot of information about those in the news as related to climate change these days. Greenhouse gases are specified gases that are released into our atmosphere through different anthropogenic effects and events, and they trap heat within our atmosphere that lead to horrible effects like climate change and global warming as a whole. And so as you can see here, cattle, both from the dairy and the beef industry, contribute to a large proportion of the greenhouse gases produced by livestock feed at a global scale. That's a whopping 62% of the livestock emissions are related to cattle. And that's about 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And so most of these greenhouse gases are actually in the form of methane burps. So this purple section, I hope you can see my cursor right here, that's called enteric fermentation. That is what we are referencing when we say the methane burps or the methane emissions. And while feed and manure that you can see here are in the blue and the green portions of this section, they do end up being substantial contributors. You can see in the larger representation of this circle that they are quite complex. They can involve the actual feed production, application of manures and fertilizer and crop residues. And the manure system talks about nitrous oxide management as well as manure methane management. They're quite complicated, to be putting it bluntly. And burping is simple. Burping is a very clean part of this circle, this purple section right here. And removing that from the emissions equation can be a real contributor to mitigating climate change in a meaningful way. And to put those methane burps into context, you can see how different greenhouse gases have different global warming potential, or GWP, and contributions. So carbon dioxide is one of the ones that we think of the most, and it is the most prolific, as you can see in the large green part of this pie chart. But it also makes up such a small proportion. It also has a low heat index, GWP. So it actually traps a lot less heat than some of the other greenhouse gases that are of interest to our projects. And so in sort of contrast, you can see these fluorinated gases, they trap a ton of heat into our atmosphere, but they make up such a small proportion of our current emissions. So you can see only 2% of the entire equation. In methane, you can see in yellow, that's 16% of the contribution there. It in fact has 28 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide, and it still makes up a decent piece of the pie, making it yet again an important greenhouse gas to target our research on. And we know that methane is important, and we now know that greenhouse gases are large contributors to climate change, and that cows produce a lot of methane. Next, we need to look at what role the microbes can play in the cow's gut in terms of feed efficiency, but also in terms of methane production. So some people think that most of this methane production is released from the back end of the cow, but in fact, most of it is burped out from the rumen, which is the first compartment of the cow's digestive tract. And methane emissions are fairly high for dairy and beef cattle, as you can see in this figure here. Pork and chicken are not ruminant animals, so they don't actually burp out methane like cows and goats and sheep do, but they do have a carbon footprint, and most of that is due to their feed production. And you can see that buffalo also are on this methane emissions graphic, but buffalo are farmed at a far lesser level than the other types of livestock, especially within the United States. All right. So the microbiota in the rumen influence both digestion and gas release. Oh, I think it skipped over a slide. There we are. And so it's a very diverse environment, and it's composed of ciliates and bacteria and fungi, and also archaea, some of which are methane producers that we call methanogens. And there we are. So methanogens make up methane, or CH4, if we go back to our chemistry days in Introduction to Chemistry. And then they also are, this is important because they prevent hydrogen gas, or H2, from building up in the gut microbiome and the gut system. And excess hydrogen does lower the performance of dairy cows. So that is an important thing to note, that these methanogens are in fact performing a service to the cows. But the carbon molecule in that CH4 that the hydrogen molecules are attached to in terms of methane, that's an energy source if we think back to those intro chemistry days. Any carbon is an energy source. And so a cow burping methane can actually account for a 6 to 12% energy loss. And when you calculate that, it actually is the same amount of energy that a cow can gain from grazing for 1 to 2 months out of the year. So that's a lot of carbon that is being lost in these methane burps that can't be utilized for other components in the cow's energy expenditures. So with a balanced diet, that hydrogen gas, that H2, can actually be released quite naturally. And the algae that we are proposing to use may change the relative abundance of methane producing gut microbes. And that would leave that carbon molecule in that cow's energy sink. And that can contribute possibly to more milk production or body growth for beef production, or just general body health and immune defense. So there's a lot of endless possibilities if we can reduce the methane emissions while still allowing that hydrogen to be replaced. So I love showing this example study here because it just reflects, even without having any sort of treatments, how important these gut microbiomes can be in cows. So in this study, they examined methane production for 72 beef cattle. And then they looked at the rumen microbial community of the 4 cows that produced the most and the least amount of methane naturally, not because of had differences in their diets at all, but just the natural change or abundance of methane produced. So you can see that those that don't produce as much methane, if you can see my cursor, this low group right here, they also have a lower abundance of archaea, and those are those methanogens, those methane producers. And they also found shifts to higher abundance in other common bacterial families that are found in ruminal microbiomes, such as this Succinovibrionaceae is an example one. So what this just illustrates in these nice bar charts is that clearly the community does shift with the ability to release methane from the gut. So changing how those methanogens, those methane producers, are contributing to this gut microbiome can be a really great way to move forward. So again, I keep on saying I'm from the Bigelow Laboratory of Ocean Sciences. So where do seaweeds come into the mix here? What role do they play? And I think a lot of us are realizing the importance of microbiomes these days. The human gut microbiome is in the news often, and folks can talk about how they contribute to certain health issues, whether positive or negative. And it's hard really to study any one species anymore without understanding its relationships to its gut microbes or its microbiome in general. And in fact, a lot of researchers are now focused on what's called the holobiont. And this term was first used in corals to explain the relationship between the zooxanthellae animal in a coral and the dinoflagellate alga, which is the thing that's responsible for the coral bleaching, that lives within that zooxanthellae structure. And then along with those two symbiotic organisms, you've got a diversity of other microbes, lots of bacteria, lots of fungi, et cetera, et cetera. So only as a whole can you study a coral, or certainly a coral reef, hence the term holobiont. And there's a lot of work looking into this seaweed microbiome right now. And we do know that there are certain beneficial mutualistic relationships where the alga and certain bacteria can actually exchange resources in this mutualistic relationship. We also know that some bacteria can be damaging and pathogentic, which is usually how we think of bacterial infections, right? However, something that scientists have discovered about macroalgae or seaweeds is that they have the ability to release what's called reactive oxygen species, or ROS, in what are called oxidative bursts, which literally blast off damaging microbes. And so this is a defense mechanism so that it's against biofouling of the macroalgae, because if it's fouled, then it cannot gain sunlight. So it's a negative thing if the alga is overfouled with pathogenic bacteria. So scientists now know that macroalgae have the ability to actually manipulate their bacterial communities. And that's why they started focusing on looking how seaweed might actually alter the rumen microbiome of cows. So that's how cows and seaweed come around full circle. And it's important to know that there are a wide variety of options for livestock methane mitigation currently, including simple animal breeding programs where you select those low methane emitting cows, such as the ones in that study that I showed again. There's a spectrum of natural occurring methane emission across cows in general, or sometimes simply increasing feed efficiency so that you need to provide less feed to get more product from an animal. And there are even, you can see the bottom here, these little masks that have been produced to capture the methane as the cow breathes. And that's well and good because if it protects from climate change. But again, that carbon is still then leaving the cow. It's still emitted from the cow and can't be used for another energetic source. But a lot of the effort in this area has actually been focused on manipulating that microbiome that I've been talking about, and sort of trying to disrupt that methanogenesis and decrease the methanogen population within the gut. So there's a couple products out there that are synthetic, made in a lab, like this 3-NOP, or trinitrooxypropanol. So those are some options out there. There are other options like Mutrol, which are organic products that use garlic and citrus components to reduce methane emissions. And then these are able to suppress methane by roughly 30%, so they are quite effective. But perhaps there are other feed supplements that are equally or even more effective at suppressing methane, and maybe they don't require a fancy lab or lots of cropland with irrigation systems and fertilizer having to be applied to them. So enter algae. So various types of algae have been found to reduce methane emissions, and these are methane emission reductions of upwards of 99%. So they're practically fully effective. And one that's often in the news a lot is this one, this beautiful feathery red alga called Asparagopsis taxiformis. As the research field grows, it is becoming apparent that multiple and regional solutions might be needed to combat climate change at this scale. And for instance, Asparagopsis is a tropical seaweed, and it is in fact invasive to the US in US waters. And so currently, apart from its native land of Tasmania, it's unable to be grown in the natural water environment or farmed. In fact, it has to be grown in tank cultures that are land-based systems. And these land-based systems require a lot of energy to heat it and to light it, to make sure that they recirculate, to give the algae the proper environment to be able to be prolific and multiply. And so all of those factors actually increase the carbon footprint of the production of this algae. So it's an incredibly important solution for certain areas of the world, but perhaps it might be more difficult to be a global solution and remain carbon neutral or carbon negative. And besides, we've got over 1 billion cattle worldwide. And so multiple strategies are going to be needed to combat this climate crisis. And so that's where Maine kind of comes into the picture. So Maine's seaweed industry is the largest within the US, with Alaska catching up quickly behind us. Maine's landings in 2021 were about 500,000 pounds, 500,000 pounds. And the 2021 preliminary calculations do seem to be much higher than that. And so it's really exponentially growing within the state. Some of these are already, most of these, in fact, that are aquaculture products are used for human food products that could expand into livestock feed. We also have a lot of wild harvesters like this person who is harvesting rockweed in a sustainable manner. And they are already marketing their product as an animal feed supplement. And so we're working, Dr. Nicole Price and I, we run the Bigelow Center for Seafood Solutions. And the idea for this center is that we come up with science-based solutions to seafood industry partners' queries or problems. And so seaweed harvesters and farmers approached the center and wondered whether some of the seaweeds that we were already producing from Maine could in fact be used as animal feed to suppress methane emissions. And that's really where this research began. And so in order to go on this pretty large adventure, we came up with some important criteria to guide our research in figuring out which algal candidates are of most import and how to select them appropriately. So these are some of the four foci that I will talk about tonight. And so the first is just algal selection and suitability, whether or not they are in fact effective at mitigating climate change by reducing enteric methane emissions from cows. And then, of course, whether they are able to be produced at volumes to be effective as an animal feed. Next, of course, to be able to scale up and sustainably produce that algae in a way that's not going to be damaging to our environments. And lastly, in order for it to be adopted, it of course needs to be profitable for all of the members of the industry, including the seaweed industry and the dairy producers themselves. So those are the four criteria that we're going to focus on reviewing tonight. I really like making sure folks get a moment to review this particular figure. This is from a paper that came out of our lab and in collaboration with many others in 2020 that looks at sort of the general basis of what any sort of seaweed component that you would be interested in producing we'd need to keep in mind to be able to incorporate it into a livestock feed. So there's the foundational research, and then of course application at a scale that's going to actually aid at an industry-wide level. And then of course, keeping in mind any ecological implications, good or bad, to make sure that we're doing right by all of our ecosystem services that could be created from these opportunities. So a lot of the foundational research, meaning the identifying of those species for cultivation and all of the different processing techniques that we can investigate to determine whether we can capture the methane emitting or methane reducing products, and of course keep them shelf stable. That work has been done at Bigelow Laboratories. And then when we find something that looks promising, we start working with our other partners to go to stages of animal trials. And this is where they're also going to be measuring enteric methane emissions. And then of course, looking at animal performance and making sure that the animals remain safe. And then we also have to take into account human safety. So all of the milk and or meat is biopsied, the flesh is biopsied to make sure that all of the products that could be coming off of an animal that's fed an algal supplement are in fact safe to consume. And then of course, palatability and intake. So cows, I have learned, are quite picky, quite picky eaters. And so we need to make sure that it's going to be a product that will in fact be easily adoptable for cows. And down the road, we also want to make sure that it's going to be taken up by our consumers themselves, and making sure that it's a product that actually is marketable and desired by just us average folks that are going into the grocery store and picking up our milk. And so the next sort of phase of work that needs to be kept in mind when creating these types of products is that industrial scale application. So we need to establish land-based, nearshore or offshore seaweed farms and look into methods that are scalable for harvest and processing. And then looking into distribution, tracking transportation networks and all of the energy expenditures that it would take to get this product and incorporate it into feeds, and then make sure it's available for our dairy and beef cattle producers to actually use. So all of those factors in supply chain also have to be taken into account. And then of course, ecological implications. So in seaweed farming, there's a lot of positives or ecosystem services that could be related to farming the seaweed to create this algal supplement. Carbon sequestration is one that's very hot topic in the news right now. So it might be that farmers might be able to get a carbon credit for being able to sequester more carbon, just like planting trees. And then seaweeds are also known to reduce ocean acidification, at least at a local level. There's something called the halo effect around a seaweed farm. And in fact, if you co-culture shellfish, such as oysters or mussels, around a seaweed farm, the shells of those shellfish, in fact, are harder, more durable, making a better product, and a product that can sustain or withstand a lot of sort of the, well, I wouldn't say that it would be able to beat all odds of any sort of infection or bacterial outbreak. But again, if you have a harder shell, you have a better and safer product. And in general, seaweeds are really good at absorbing excess nutrients. And so folks are looking at how seaweeds can improve water quality. And in fact, seaweeds could be grown close to wastewater treatment facilities to uptake any excess nitrogen that might be going into the water systems. And not only are carbon markets of import, but nitrogen markets are also of import and could be another way to receive credits for being able to farm that seaweed product. And then of course, we want to make sure that we track any water and energy expenditures for any of the onshore production. So all of the seaweed aquaculture in Maine still has a very, very short nursery time where it does require some tanks and it does require some lighting and recirculating water systems, et cetera. And so we want to make sure that the energetics of any of that are not to a point where it would be become detrimental to our carbon footprint of any product that we're interested in pursuing. And equally, we have to look at the ecological implications on the ruminant-based livestock industry. And of course, our large focus is to ensure that we are in fact reducing methane emissions in dairy cows. But we also might be able to improve feed utilization. So if we are able to have this alga that can be high in fiber or high in protein, help improve that feed utilization, then a farmer may not have to feed quite as much or quite as diverse of a diet to their cows, which might increase their production or help their bottom line. And also, it's important to note that seaweeds are used as human food products because they're very high in nutrients and very high in great minerals and vitamins. And cows need minerals and vitamins too. And in fact, dairy diets, I have learned, are incredibly dialed in. And there are mineral premixes that are added and can be changed and adapted even on a monthly scale. And so it might be that the seaweed can contribute to some of that nutritional profile. And so that's another aspect of creating an algal feed for the dairy industry and potentially for the beef industry as well. So just going through those criteria that we have set for ourselves and sort of focusing on this endeavor. First, algal selection, right? We want to make sure that we pick an alga that is native to the region that we're going to try to produce it in. And we want to make sure that that production is only going to be scalable if it's done in a sustainable way, in a sustainable method. We also, of course, want to make sure that it produces sufficient bioactive compounds to actually combat those methane burps, or else that's not really a great starting point if it can't, in fact, reduce the methane emissions of cows. We also, again, want to make sure that it's safe for animal and human consumption and learn anything about its nutritional value right up front. And it's important, I've been talking about macroalgae or seaweed a lot of this time, but like I said before, we're going to need regional solutions. So we're also keeping our eye on microalgae that could be mass produced perhaps inland, where it might not make sense to bring a kelp product all the way from the coast into the Midwest to be able to reduce methane emissions and have that carbon hoofprint still be net neutral or net negative. And so microalgae or a blend of the two might be a solution that we need to keep in mind. And the second criteria that we need to make sure of is that criteria that needs to be scalable in a sustainable manner. So just quick calculations just to show you what I'm talking about. In 2020, we had landings of about 500,000 pounds here in the state of Maine. And we currently have about 28,000 dairy cows in Maine. And so if we do a calculation of just a general feed ratio for a dairy cow and an inclusion rate, and talk about the 365 days of the year and convert it from a dry grain mix to what would be a wet sloppy seaweed equivalent in terms of wet bait, we would need about 40 million pounds of seaweed just for Maine's dairy industry. And we're now producing about 500,000, although it is exponentially growing. So you can see we've got a little bit of work to do. So anything that we're going to investigate, we need to make sure is scalable in a very, very sustainable manner. But have no fear, when we're talking about worldwide production, Maine's actually, despite the fact that it's #1 in the US, is still way behind the 8 ball. So just landings in 2019 for seaweed, we were at 76 billion wet pounds. So that 40 million that's needed to support Maine's dairy industry is definitely going to be possible. So it's really about making sure that we get technology transfer, we get buy-in for being able to mass produce, and make sure that we only adopt techniques that are going to be sustainable and right for our environments. And I said, we've been focusing a lot about seaweed and macroalgae, but we are keeping our eye on the prize with microalgae as being an important component for regional solutions as well. And in fact, there's a company in Nebraska, called Veramaris, and they make a fish-free omega-3 fatty acid component for salmon feed. Previously, they were using oil fish to actually produce a fish feed for salmon. And so this is using a microalgae to solve that problem instead. And the USDA also just granted a $10 million award to look at producing microalgae as chicken feed. Now, remember that chicken are not ruminants, but they still have a carbon footprint for their feed that is high. And so if microalgae can provide some of those nutrients in a more sustainable method, producing less and reduce the carbon footprint for that particular industry, that's something that is notable and important to pursue. So the third criterion that we've set for ourselves is to focus on sustainability. And so I wanted to take a minute to just introduce you folks to what we call life cycle assessments, or LCAs. They're also known as cradle to grave assessments. The idea is that you track every single aspect of a potential product that you want to make, from the conception and creation of, in this case, a seaweed on a farm, and then having that seaweed get driven to a processor, all of the energetic inputs that that processor has to use to create a shelf-stable product. And then, of course, a transportation network analysis for understanding the distribution of that product. And then all of the energy expenditures at the farm for utilizing that seaweed, and how a dairy cow uses that seaweed to maybe reduce something like other feed or other nutritive needs. And then, of course, the disposal or recycling of any products of interest. In this case, we have to look at the manure that's coming off of a cow that's eaten algae, and whether or not there's benefits or special things that can be done with a manure that actually is seaweed enriched. And so in our case, we're looking at both aquaculture and wild harvest of macroalgae. And then we're also looking at how to commercially scale up photobioreactors to produce microalgae. And then we're also keeping in mind that we could use the manure as fertilizers for the croplands that are producing feed for the dairy industry. So you can see it gets quite complicated quite fast. And so these life cycle assessments, and our team that's doing it, they take every single piece of data that we are collecting across all of our collaborators, and we make sure that we give them every little energetic expenditure that we use, so that they can determine whether or not our product has the potential to still be net negative in terms of carbon footprint. Because if something is taking so much energy to produce that it's not really helping fight climate change, because even though it's reducing methane emissions, but it takes tons of carbon dioxide and the fuel to move around that product, then we're really not solving our problem, and we're really not helping our world in the fight against climate change. And the next criterion, of course, is profitability. If you want folks to adopt something, it needs to be something that's going to help them out in terms of their bottom line, or certainly at least not hurt their bottom line. So dock prices per pound in seaweed in Maine is actually dropping. And that's why a lot of our farmers are interested in being able to create products that are not just for human consumption, because then you can produce a lot of it. And so even though that price per pound is dropping slightly, you can produce more of it and still turn a profit for your company. And again, most seaweed companies are able to produce a lot of seaweed, but where the bottleneck is actually in the processing. Currently, for the seaweeds cultivated in the US for human consumption, there are 3 methods for processing: dried and milled, fresh frozen or flash frozen, and then a new one that's come on to the processing markets is fermentation. So here's an example of the Atlantic Sea Farms fermented seaweed salad made with our local sugar kelp. And so again, trying to make sure that these efforts are going to be profitable for the seaweed farmer are incredibly important, or else they're not going to be interested in scaling up and producing for algal markets. Intriguingly, it would be a more stable market because it's not going to be fluctuating based on consumer whims or restaurant menus or other things. So it it might be a more sustainable, profitable sector for these farmers. And we also have to think about the dairy producers from this. Folks that are producing milk, they are on a tight margin as it is. And so really what's going to come down to is a lot of the co-ops that some of these farmers are in, especially in the organic sector, they have their own climate initiatives that are trying to help aid or supply perhaps a credit system for farmers who adapt and adopt new feed supplements and are able to reduce their enteric methane emissions. And so this is sort of an example of the carrot trying to reward good behavior, if you will. And we see a lot of examples of those programs popping up locally around us. But with the carrot, there's always those who use a stick. And so interestingly, there's a new law in New Zealand that's actually going to tax farmers for the methane emissions from the cow burps of their, cow and sheep burps from all of their ruminating animals. And so it's an incentive to adopt some of these feed supplements to be able to reduce that carbon hoofprint so that you do not have that methane tax affecting your bottom line. Now, while this is a stick, it is important to note that New Zealand is close to Tasmania, and so there are regional solutions where that Asparagopsis taxiformis, that red algae that I was talking about, can be mass produced in a scalable and a sustainable manner. And so there is a way forward for this group to be able to adopt something that is going to be effective for them and therefore help out their bottom line. So in terms of what we are doing, just actually all hands on deck and what we do on a day-to-day basis. Once we've sort of explored all of these criteria for an alga on a hypothetical level, we actually do a lot of laboratory experiments to be able to understand the digestibility and the elemental analysis to understand any nutrients that are in these candidate algae. And then of course, they have to be able to reduce methane emissions. And so we have what's known as the bottle herd at Bigelow Laboratories, where we have these little bottles that act as tiny little proxies for cow stomachs. And we have, we actually gain rumen fluid from some of our participating farms, and we can measure the gases that come off of these rumens when we dose it with certain feed additives and certain algae, so we can determine whether or not they are able to reduce methane emissions, at least in this small in vitro lab scale. And so if we find something that's a great candidate at a laboratory level, then we can go to our partners and look into animal trials. So these cows right now in this picture are eating a little bit of seaweed that's been dosed out for them, and they eat twice a day. And they eat it right over their, it's called top dress, where they're given their little hay in the afternoon, and they get a little bit of a seaweed dressing on top. And this green machine that you can see here it's produced by a company called Sealock, and it's called a green feed. And the idea is that the cow willingly will approach the green feed because it has tiny little cow candies in there. It's molasses treats. And so we entice the cow to the machine, and the cow has an RFID tag in its ear, which we can then determine what treatment group it's in. So what type of algae it's been fed, at what dosage. And the cow just willingly puts its head in the chamber and eats its little treat. And during that session of a couple minutes, the cow, all of the emissions from that cow's mouth are measured. So we're able to measure hydrogen gas output, and carbon dioxide, and total gas, and methane. And so that's where we get to understand how a seaweed or algal candidate is affecting things at an animal trial level. And then we take all of this information and we hand it over to folks that are doing those supply chain analyses and transportation network analyses and those life cycle assessments. And we have social scientists, we have economists and we have social scientists and all sorts of team members galore that are going to take all of this information and set up supply chains and try to determine whether or not we can gain an adaptability to a product of interest. And so it's a whirlwind tour of what we do, but it just goes to show, and I don't expect you to be able to read the supply chain. I just wanted to show an example of how complicated it can be to be able to produce a product such as a seaweed supplement for the dairy industry. So now when we revisit that carbon hoofprint that we looked at before, I just want to point out how many impacts an algal feed could have on that carbon hoofprint. And it can happen at multiple stages. It would be wonderful if that entire purple section, 44.3% of this carbon hoofprint, could be completely reduced and eliminated, in fact, by having a seaweed supplement added to a dairy cow feed. Interestingly enough, we might be able to learn a lot about how that manure is changing based on whether a cow is eating seaweed or not. And that could mean that we have better management of the methane emissions and the nitrous oxide emissions that generally occur from these manure lagoons. And that might be able to be reduced as well. And that's another way that we can fight these methane emissions and reduce our greenhouse gases. And then, of course, feedstock adds to the manure for biogas generation. That's another thing that we're exploring through anaerobic digesters. And then when we come around towards the feed side of things, of course, we are replacing some of the feed when we're giving the seaweed off and giving additional nutrients and protein and fiber sources. And so that could also affect the carbon hoofprint. And in fact, could also be used as a direct fertilizer for seaweed to be put on the cropland, or an indirect fertilizer if the manure itself has higher nutrient component because the cow had been fed seaweed. So there's numerous things that can be explored and that can hopefully help us reduce the methane emissions of the dairy industry within the United States and hopefully worldwide. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for listening to me, and I will be happy to answer any and all questions.
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte. That was so interesting and a topic that I never expected to learn so much about, but really exciting to see all that's happening there.
Great.
So folks can type any questions they have in the chat box. We have a couple that have come in already, but you should see the chat icon on the bottom of your screen and just pop them right in there and we will get to them in the order they come in. So great work, Charlotte, as the Orleans Conservation Trust is beginning to test vegetation management with goats, which we're doing on one of our properties. Do you know of any data relative to greenhouse gas emissions from goats and how we should be thinking about that, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of people ask us why cows, like they eat so much more than goats, and goats can answer the same questions you have, and rightfully so, they can. And if you look at the global population of goats, especially in Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia, they are definitely large contributors to these methane emissions. The major problem is that that green feed system that I showed, let me see if I can back up a little bit. Here, this is built for a cow. And that's honestly really the answer, is that the actual equipment that is available to be able to run these types of experiments at scale isn't built for goats yet. There are these walk-in chambers that any animal, any ruminant can go in, and then they are able to look at all of the gas ins and gas outs, and they do get these measurements. But of course, the animal can only even be in there for certain times of day, and it's a smaller amount of data that can be procured from that. And it's very expensive to produce those. There aren't that many of those around. And so really it comes down to the fact that there are fewer ways to measure this in goats. So there's a little bit less data. That being said, there's very little for us to believe that the rumination and the effects that it would have on cows would be all that different for other ruminants like goats and sheep. So we're really hoping that this could be more universal, but we're gonna measure it in cows first.
Well, I have to say, I love the, I'll call it a juxtaposition of something as simple as a cow going to enjoy its treat, and it's got a chip and this high-tech machine that is measuring so much as the cow is just enjoying that simple pleasure.
Yes,
Pretty neat.
absolutely. They line up, they love it. So
Another question, by comparison, what is the human carbon footprint compared to the cows? And so I'm sure that varies from person to person, but I take that question to mean kind of over the course of somebody's life, how does their carbon footprint compare to that over the course of the life of, say, a dairy cow?
yeah, that I would say I would never ever deem to tell you a number. So I apologize that I couldn't tell you that offhand. But just from baseline understanding that cows don't drive cars, and they only are vegetarians, and they don't utilize any plastic. Well, maybe they do if their feed bins, et cetera, but in general, and their lifespan is shorter than ours, about 25 years, I believe. Well, some are 25 years, in industry a lot shorter. But yes, so I believe it's really not comparable, that we are the worser than the cows in general. I hope that answers your question, but I don't know enough about the numbers for comparison. But yeah.
Yeah, it definitely can vary quite a bit depending on your diet and lifestyle. How much you're flying is always the biggest question in determining your carbon footprint.
Exactly.
Cut back
And again, I'm just not familiar with those numbers for humans, so I couldn't venture a guess.
Regarding seaweed, is there a seasonality to the production and harvesting that needs to be considered?
Absolutely, yeah. So generally speaking, most of the seaweed production in the US right now is kelps. And so these kelps are generally put out on long lines. People are starting to think about it right now, actually, by October or November. And what's nice about this is they're just overwintered. Folks can check on them a few times over the course of the winter to make sure that a storm hasn't ripped up their farm or anything. But it's really a set it and forget it type of farming initiatives. And then in the spring, around April to May to June, depending on further down the line. I mean, you guys in Massachusetts would be closer to May or June, but that's when you'd go out and harvest. And it's really within 6 weeks, you've done, well, 4 weeks, you've really done all of the harvest over your entire lease site. And that leaves you the entire summer to explore other fisheries currently. So a lot of the folks that are aquaculturists in Maine right now, seaweed aquaculturists, are lobster folk, because then they have June, July, August to go and lobster. And so it's about diversifying their landings and utilizing all of their knowledge and their gear and their boats during the winter months when it wouldn't have been going to use anyways. That being said, that we are exploring how to produce certain red algae, like Palmaria and Gracilaria. Those are some red algae that would be able to be produced in the summer months, so that while those kelps are on the line, or off the lines, I should say, and off the farms, there would be other landings that folks that just wanted to focus on seaweed aquaculture could grow. But that's still a little bit in its infancy right now.
Great. Thank you. So I've got one related to dairy cows versus beef cows or beef cattle. And I know in Maine, the industry definitely skews towards dairy cows. Is this work that you have described with kind of a broad brush here tonight just as applicable to beef cattle, or are there some important differences between those two as far as their methane emissions? And is one of those two being targeted, I'll say, more than the other as far as looking for a solution?
Yeah, well, I would say that the general differences in dairy and beef cows are longevity. So a dairy cow is a part of the industry for a longer period of time than a beef cattle, excuse me, are. Beef cattle also eat a heck of a lot more. So in terms of an inclusion rate, a percentage of their diet, it would require more of a dose of an algal product rather than a dairy cow, just because their sheer size, they're just bigger. And sort of to be able to have some sort of efficacy, you would need more seaweed for them. Sadly, I learned that there's not as much distinction in between those two lines, because dairy cows become beef cows at the end of their dairy experience. It's usually in the ground beef industry that those dairy cows go. So we do need to look at both at the same time. And so we're going to be taking biopsies, muscle biopsies, for cows that are no longer with us, that are produced or are in our dairy trials. So again, they're kind of they will definitely need separate animal trials when we want to fully break into the beef industry, because that's how they're regulated. But in terms of understanding how it will affect dairy cows and beef cows, their feed formulation is incredibly different. And so how we would introduce a seaweed supplement to beef industry would probably take some more work and more effort. But in general knowledge, in terms of rumination, the premise would be the same.
Thank you. And then, are you aware of any examples across the country where seaweed or any kind of microalgae as well are already being used as a livestock feed supplement, aside from any kind of trial studies that are occurring?
Absolutely, yeah. There's 3 companies I can think of right off the top of my head in Maine, that I'm trying to see, I got them all the way at the beginning of my presentation, but of course it's deciding to be silly. But yeah, so we have Source Micronutrients. They are a wild harvest group that is producing a rockweed product. And then we also work with Ocean Organics, or have relationships with folks at Ocean Organics, and they produce other supplements that can be used for dairy and pet food. But a lot of that is actually in the equine industry as well, so for horses. And so there's definitely already animal products that are being produced mostly from sustainably wild harvested sources in Maine. So again, we've got the way to maneuver into that field sort of already established in the state of Maine.
Yeah, that's really obviously important. And I was, wondering about the economics. So it's great to hear that some of that is already happening.
Yeah. North American kelp is another producer in the state of Maine that along the same lines. So.
Got it. Great. Let's see. Do I need deep water to grow seaweed?
Yes and no. It depends on what you want to grow. So generally speaking, when we're talking about seaweed in New England, we're talking about kelp. So you want those, they're actually suspended on long lines. And so all you need is the water to not allow for the negatively buoyant kelp that are just going to be sort of drifting on this long line to scrape the bottom. And kelp can grow when harvested to 9 to 10 feet easily. Most people are growing in about 30 feet of water in Maine, just because that is where you're getting enough of the correct water circulation. That's better for kelp. They like a little bit of a rougher water and churning and such, and you just don't get that in shallower water. Also in shallower water, you would have more stagnant water, means more chances for growth of things like epiphytes and tunicates and things like that could reduce the quality of your product. So again, a lot of people like keeping it a little bit further offshore to make sure you get the kind of right water mixing to make sure your crop is clean and at its best. So yeah.
Just as a follow-up on that, if folks are interested in seeing one of these operations locally, right, in Chatham, there's a company called Chatham Kelp, and it doesn't look like much unless you can, go out there in a kayak or a boat or something and really take a close look. But from shore, you can stand on Harding's Beach in Chatham and just look off, and you'll see several yellow buoys kind of clustered together, and they're growing kelp there. And I know that water isn't too deep, but Charlotte made some good points.
And
there.
that's the thing about kelp aquaculture and seaweed aquaculture in general is you don't really see it from the shore at all. It's just a couple buoys and mooring, large mooring buoys. So it's all right below the surface, about a meter below the surface, 3 feet under the surface, that all the action's happening. So you don't want to drive your boat over it probably, but other than that, it's pretty low profile.
Let's see, another one just came in. Do you have an anticipated amount of time this research will take before mainstream adoption of seaweed as feed for cows?
Well, I'll just tell you that our funding sources are for 5 years. And so we have animal experiments and sort of research plans that are going to be going out for another 5 years at the very least. I wouldn't expect that to mean that we could have a universal adoption at that point. I think that it's going to really depend on policy push too, because in order for things to be profitable, especially for the dairy industry, where they don't have as much negotiation on the price point for the poundage of their milk, it really needs to be that they could receive a carbon credit or something else to incentivize them. And until we get carbon markets and sort of buy-in for those types of structures to be set up, I don't see this as being able to be widely adopted. And so that's another part of what we're doing is, saying it loud, saying it proud, making sure that people start taking this seriously so that we can support the industry in the way that we need to get wide adoption, because if only at a national and hopefully global scale can this help mitigate climate change. I think it will be easier to break into the organic dairy section. We've had some great surveys brought out, at least in Maine dairy, and we're also now expanding into the tri-state New York area and the rest of New England. And it's encouraging that despite the fact that, again, those profit margins are slim, a lot of folks in the organic dairy sector just want to do the right thing, which is incredible of them. And so I think we're going to have some early adoption in the organic sector.
That's great. Really exciting. Do you have a sense for why the price of seaweed has dropped in Maine? I was curious to see that. Surprised.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think it's the pandemic mostly. A lot of the restaurants that were doing direct supply for some of these smaller farms, where there's not an actual product like that seaweed salad or kimchi or things like that, that could be shelf stable and distributed. A lot of those other providers didn't have a place to be able to sell their product because all the restaurants shut down. And I just think that it's getting back, but it's just sort of a bump that's hit everyone, right? It's affected everyone. So
certainly affected us in all aspects of life.
Absolutely. And again, I think that rightfully so, seaweed farmers were like, why would I want to be in animal industry where I know the price per pound is going to be less because I can get a really nice price for a high quality food industry, a human food product. And so I think folks were less inclined to explore the animal market, but knowing how steady it would be to be able to supply and at the scale that would be required has really incentivized people to re-explore that option, so there's a silver lining, I suppose, to the COVID crisis in the industry.
Yeah, and maybe there's room for government subsidies at some point down the road as it does start to hopefully take hold and scale up.
Absolutely. Here's hoping.
Yeah. Well, I think we have gotten through all our questions, and you did an excellent job answering those. This was just a really fun presentation for the group, I think, to be able to get outside our area of expertise, perhaps, and really kind of dive into a topic that most of us are certainly not thinking about on a daily basis, but it's really fun to hear from you about all the exciting work you're involved in and what's happening across the country that we had no idea was happening. So
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me on, and I really appreciate the questions. It's my favorite favorite part is to be able to engage with you folks. So I really do appreciate it. And thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate your time being able to zoom in and join us. And folks who are listening in, we have our Orleans Conservation Trust annual meeting coming up on September 12th. So the evening of September 12th, come on down to the Orleans Yacht Club, and we will be there starting at 4:30 p.m. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. And a big thanks again to Charlotte, and have a wonderful night, everyone.
See ya.
Thank you.